Okay, this is week 4. Happy Chuseok, first of all. You don't have to watch this by Wednesday. I will set the window starting from Monday so that you have longer to watch it. I've started this video 4 or 5 times and had to stop because there's too much information to cover. So I'm going to just focus on the things that you need to know. And if there's any questions about how things are connected, because they are, we'll settle those things on Friday and we'll do a little bit of review. I have to do 3 videos and I'm still on the first one. So yeah, this is why doing the class online, like during Corona, was really tough. So just bear with me, listen as well as you can. If you don't understand something, we'll follow up next Friday in person in the lecture hall, okay? So we're talking about the Middle Ages. Let's just start with that first. I don't want this to come across as a history lesson, I told you. There is a lot of history involved in this class, but it's a cultural studies class. We're more interested in the ideas and in the influences, how it affects human society, than what order they come in or what dates or what names are involved. You do need to remember the names, but remember the names in connection to why they're important, not what year they were born. So the Middle Ages is just a catch-all term. We talked about the Roman period, the Romano-Britons, the Roman Empire fell, and Europe sort of broke into states, smaller states, and occasionally, like in 800 AD, Charlemagne would unify under the Frankish Empire, would unify Western Europe, and there's the Holy Roman Empire, which is sort of the central state, a kind of conglomeration of many different cities and states that exists for hundreds of years. But for the most part, the Roman Empire collapses and smaller states replace it. They lose some of the technology, they lose some of the knowledge and some of the networking. A lot of it sort of goes underground or disappears. Notoriously, or not notoriously, but famously in England, I mentioned the city of Bath, where they sort of forgot how to repair the aqueducts and forgot how to, a lot of the technical skills that the Romans had, for example, running water or road construction or communication, philosophical learning, a lot of these things, libraries, some of this knowledge just sort of got translated or moved or buried, and it was inaccessible. So that's why some people call it the Dark Ages, the period between the classical era of Greek and Roman Western civilization and the Renaissance, where some of that knowledge was recovered and Italy starts the Renaissance, and then it spreads across Europe, and the early modern period emerges, from the dust. Lots of people don't like that term. During the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages of Europe, is when Islam conquers and spreads across Africa and into South Asia, into Central Asia, South Asia, and eventually the Ottoman Empire of the Turks will spread all the way north through Europe into almost to Vienna, to Austria. So it's not the Dark Ages in China, it's not the Dark Ages in the Middle East, but it is sort of the Dark Ages in Europe. But Europe gets involved with a lot of things, and the globalization doesn't really get started until, the age of exploration. But the Vikings certainly, their range goes from Canada all the way to Constantinople in the Black Sea in Turkey. And the Mongolian Empire during the Dark Ages, again, spreads across from from Belarus, Ukraine, Hungary, all the way to Japan. So this is why we call it the Middle Ages. Instead, it's still not a very good name because it just means it's in between. There's several periods where there's sort of a cultural revival, and I'm not going to go over all of them because it's impossible, and we got to talk about British culture here, not about European culture, because British and American culture is a big enough topic as it is. But we're going to start this lecture out just by understanding the next few lectures until we get to Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, Shakespeare, and all the people in the 16th century, Martin Luther, and the religious stuff that happens because of the Reformation. Until that point, basically the period we're talking about is in between the Romans and the Italian Renaissance, okay? So one of the major events that happens is something called the Crusades, and it follows right on the heels of the Norman invasion. So the Norman invasion, as you have to remember, happens in 1066, and William becomes King of England and starts the beginning of a dynasty which will, not in an unbroken line, but through relatives, still exist, right? Charles III is now King of England. Queen Elizabeth II was before him. They can trace their lineage back all the way back to William, not through the first male son, but they are related to William indirectly through cousins and aunts and uncles and so on. Okay, so the dynasty that William founds, it goes through different names and everything, but they're all related. They're all family in an unbroken line all the way back to 1066. And to add to that, William's great aunt was the daughter of, I don't think I'm getting this right, but the daughter of Edmund Ironside, and he was an Anglo-Saxon king. So you might say that the lineage goes back even further if you're going to, stretch it. In the 1090s, the Pope, and it's hard to remember which Pope. There's going to be too many names for you to remember, but just remember the Pope. We're not going to worry about whether it's Pope Urban I, Urban II. I think it's Pope Urban II, if my memory serves me correctly. But we'll just refer to him as the Pope, okay? Because there are many, many popes. There's too many to remember. So the Pope, in the 1090s, he calls for a crusade. He does a famous speech in France, and he calls for volunteers to go and retake Jerusalem, which has been taken over by Islamic armies in the Middle East. It's been taken from Byzantium, which is, we call it the Byzantine Empire. It's Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire is in decline, and they've lost control over Jerusalem. So there's a call for crusaders. The first crusade, the main forces of the Crusades overall were the Franks, the French. They were the Islamic military, the Islamic armies. They are separated in different states too, but Syria and Egypt figure the Egyptian caliphate and the Syrian caliphate at Damascus. They are two of the more important Islamic states. Eventually the Ottomans the Turkish people will form their empire at the end of the crusading era, but at the beginning, they are not a prominent, a part of the Islamic forces in the Middle East. So the first crusade goes down there. It's William the Conqueror's second son, Robert. He's a Norman, of course. He's William's son. He goes down on the first crusade. And the first crusade, the Normans are very important. The Franks and the Normans are very important. And they establish 4 crusader states down in the Middle East, and they retake Jerusalem. and they create a king of Jerusalem. A lot of people don't know about this, brief sort of Christian control of the area, but that's what happened, and they control the Holy Land for about 100 years. They send waves of crusades to reinforce, because it's a long way. It's almost like having a colony in North America. This is almost like a dress rehearsal for the British Empire. It is a sort of imperialism. Jerusalem doesn't belong to the Christians. They're attacking, and they're taking it over and asserting their power over the control, just like an empire would. Obviously, the Islamic states nearby are not going to put up with that for too long. So that's why the crusading era lasts for several hundred years, and then the Europeans withdraw because they cannot support, this overseas outpost in the middle of hostile territory, which doesn't belong to them. Let's be honest. So I know some of you are Islamic, so I'm trying to be fair to everybody. Some people are Christian, some people are not religious, some people will try to be unbiased about this. The Crusades, from the European perspective, are an important, commitment. It's to save yourself from sin. It's a commitment to the church and to your state and to your king and to the Pope and so on. They go with the idea that going on the crusade is a positive thing. It causes a lot of damage, in their own territories. Jewish people are not Christian, and often on the way to Jerusalem, or on the way to Egypt, or on the way to where their destination was, the Crusaders caused havoc on the way there. They needed money, they needed food, they needed provisions, and their targets were usually non-Christians, no matter what kind of non-Christian they were. Even they did it to other Christians. So the Crusaders were not really welcome in the Holy Land, even by the Christian, Eastern Romans. Eventually, the Crusaders will sack Constantinople, and that will probably make the Byzantine Empire weak enough that eventually the Ottoman Turks will take over Constantinople in 1453. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Third Crusade is the most famous in England, okay? You don't need to know it's the third one. You just need to know that Richard the Lionheart was the first English king to go on crusade. And of course, there was a French king, his name was Philip, and they didn't get along with each other because the French and the English historically didn't get along with each other. They were always fighting over territory in England or in France, one or the other. Sometimes the French invaded English just as often as the English invaded them. They had sea battles. They fought over territory, in Asia and North America. It'll be a common theme, this struggle for dominance between the French and the English. One of the ways that British culture and French culture develop is by virtue of knowing that they are not the opposite. Their opposites, their opposition is, I'm French because I dislike the English, and I'm English because I'm different than the French. And they live in the continent and we live in an island. It becomes a struggle of culture and definition of identity, as well as military strength and economic power as well. So Richard, he speaks French. He has land in France. He's constantly fighting. He has a sword called Excalibur, which is the same name as King Arthur's sword. He's a great warrior. He's handsome. He's tall. He's the son of Henry II. So just to put this in perspective, because we talk about the Crusades in the book here, and Thomas Becket is not mentioned, so I'm sort of doing this in reverse order. But Richard the Lionheart, he's the son, the third son, I believe. There was 5 sons, but 4 of them grew up. Henry II is the King of England. He's several generations after William. We won't worry about the names there. You need to know Henry II. He marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is a territory in France, and her father is the Duke of Aquitaine, and when he dies, her lands go to him. King Louis goes on the Second Crusade. He's a French king. He's called King Louis the Pious because he was so devoted religiously. He was famous for being devoted to the church and behaving himself pretty well. Eleanor was a very different person. Very, very, what can I say? Not a typical domesticated woman. She was into romance, and she was proud, and she was influential and intelligent, and she had all the qualities of sort of a Queen Elizabeth, you might say, or a Boudica, Queen Boudica. As I said, we don't really talk about the woman as much because they don't figure as prominently in the history books. We don't know as much about the great woman in English history, but certainly Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of the great female, powerful female characters in British culture and British history. Henry II couldn't handle her. She's older than him by 6 or 7 years. She gets divorced from the King of France, and then she marries him, and then they end up having 7 or 8 children, and she's already 30 years old. So think about this. This is the Middle Ages. People's life expectancy sometimes is 35, 40 years old, sometimes lower than that. If you live in London, it's probably 30. So like she marries the King of England, who's much younger than her, and she ends up having children. 7 of them survive, I believe, to adulthood with him. So obviously they got along. They were very ambitious people, both of them, but they end up hating each other pretty much because the sons, Eleanor supports the sons. When they grow up and they're adults, she supports them in rebelling against her father. So it's kind of Henry II he's a great king. He's very famous. He rules for many, many years, 4 decades, almost a very long time. He's very active. He rules over Ireland and half of France almost, and the British Isles. He's a powerful leader. I think he's got a bad temper. That's basically it. He's at times he would just get so angry that he didn't know what to do. There's stories of him dropping down on the floor and kind of biting the carpet, chewing on the carpet because he just couldn't control his anger. So, not somebody you want to mess with too much, but Richard was personally a great warrior. He was a warrior king. When he fought in battle, he fought and killed people with his own weapon. He's an actual medieval sort of storybook character. So he would fight personally and ride a horse into battle like a knight should, and kill his enemies with his own hands. So these sons, sometimes they were called the Lion's Brood, I think is one nickname they had for him, like the children of the lion. Basically, they're all lions. They grow up and they're all lions, and they all want, a piece of the kingdom. Henry II, though, his firstborn son Henry dies, Geoffrey dies, Henry II dies, and then the kingdom goes to Richard. Richard goes down to the Middle East. He wins some battles and he tries to take back Jerusalem, but he is stopped by Saladin the Great. He's a Kurdish man who becomes the Caliphate of Egypt, and he unifies the Islamic people of the Middle East, and with his army he prevents Richard from taking back Jerusalem. They have some famous encounters where they have to negotiate peace treaties, and they have some battles Richard ends up winning one of the major battles against Saladin, but he's unable to, he runs out of time and money and resources, and he basically has to sign a peace treaty with Saladin. So in the end, Saladin outlasts him, and they're considered two of the great characters in this drama that unfolds in the Holy Land. So Saladin, in some ways, he's the savior of the Islamic people of the Middle East, because he is the one who stops, I imagine, the people in Syria and Israel and Jordan and Iraq, well, which will become Iraq anyway. The people in those areas. Richard, of course, was a terrifying warrior king who was killing people, indiscriminately, with a giant foreign army invading their territory. So Saladin became a hero, of course, and him and Richard had a great respect for each other. And Richard ended up leaving the Holy Land, and Saladin kept Jerusalem. When Richard goes back to Europe, he gets captured, and then he gets ransomed, and he gets shot with an arrow, and then he dies. We'll leave it at that. There's more in the book. There is a section on the Crusades for you to read that just follows on the heels of the picture of the Norman castle. It talks about religion. I'll do that part in class. And it talks about the Crusades. So we're doing this sort of out of order a little bit, but the Crusades is on page 70, the page on the back side of the medieval times revolving around religion. So that's a detailed enough explanation of what happened with Richard and the Crusades. Later on, he will become part of the Robin Hood story, but Robin Hood actually is not a real person, and Richard was a real person who was similar to King Arthur. So they fused the historical person of Richard with the story of Robin Hood. And we'll talk about Robin Hood much later when we talk about American mythological figures. We'll talk about legends and stuff like Robin Hood later, because Robin Hood does actually, the story gets created much later. Arthur's story is written down in English finally around the time of Richard. So Richard's, it's kind of like the hot drama or TV show or movie during the 12th century is King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and that's why Richard imitates Arthur. It's an example of art imitating life as much as life imitating art. His younger son, Richard, dies without any, he gets married, but he doesn't have any children. So his younger brother, John, becomes king. And Prince John, he's a bad guy. I don't know how I can give him a good spin. He's in the Robin Hood story. He's the evil Prince John who rules England when Richard is away on crusades, but that's not what happened. He became king when his brother died. That's what happened in reality. And when he took over being king, first of all, he taxed. There was a lot of tax, and he was fighting in France against King Philip of France, who had gone with Richard on the Crusades, and they had disliked each other intensely. Philip manages to take back almost all of the French lands, including Normandy, which Normandy actually belongs to John technically. So John loses all of the territory. Anjou and Normandy, especially in Aquitaine, they all are lost. And he taxes the barons, and he has a bad habit of stealing people's wives, sisters, nieces, cousins, going after noble ladies that are related to his barons. The noble, he believes basically that he's the king. He has absolute power, so that he can tax people, he can take money from the rich people in the kingdom, and he can have his way with any woman he wants. This makes him very, very unpopular. And so eventually they get sick of it and they start a rebellion. So John loses his territory in France, and then the barons, the wealthy people, landowners and nobles of England, they decide that they're not going to put up with it anymore, and they start a rebellion. And they force him to sign this document called the Magna Carta. When he runs out of money and support, he has no choice but to sit down and sign this document. It's Magna Carta means Great Charter, just means great legal document in English. And when he signs this, he admits that he should follow the laws, especially when concerned with taxation, has to be approved by the representatives of the upper class, the barons, the dukes and earls and lords of the realm. They have to give him permission to raise a tax, unless there's some extraordinary circumstances. And everybody has the right to a trial. He can't throw people in jail. He can't commit crimes without being responsible for them. So he has to follow the rule of law. The king is not above the law, and the king has to get support from his vassals, from his people, from the landowners, the barons, to raise money. So this is something that he is forced to do, and so 1 year later he asked the Pope to cancel it because he said he was forced to do it. He didn't want to do it. He was threatened, so he was under duress and it shouldn't count. And the Pope canceled it, but only a few years later he dies. Maybe 2 or 3 years later he dies, and his young son, who is maybe 10 years old, he's going to inherit the throne, and in order to secure the support of the English people, he's going to have to reissue Magna Carta. And this happens repeatedly until basically the Magna Carta becomes the foundation of, parliamentary power in England, which means sharing the political power with the representatives of the people, which eventually will become the Parliament. Right now it's basically just a sort of a council of powerful, wealthy English nobles, but eventually it'll become the representative body of the English constitutional monarchy. So the Magna Carta doesn't have a big effect the year it's signed, because it was canceled and had to be reissued multiple times, but over time it becomes the established rule of law in the English justice system. They do not have a constitution. Unlike Korea or Canada or Australia or the United States, the United Kingdom just has a sort of series of precedents and law that they hold in common. It is called the English Common Law, which goes back farther than Magna Carta, but the Magna Carta is the most significant document in the development of English common law. And the American Constitution is written based on the English common law. So this is the ancestor of the US Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, the Australian Constitution, and many other countries. Vietnam based theirs off the United States Constitution, which was based on Magna Carta, which was based on English common law, which is based on Magna Carta. So this is the ancestor of many democratic constitutions in the world. And that's why it's important to remember, and 1215 is a number that you have to remember too. As I said to you before, there's castles all over England. They're all over the place. England wasn't invaded and destroyed in the last several hundred years the way other European countries were. So many of these old castles, people sometimes think that some of the walls and so on are Roman, or the skeletons of forts are Roman, but most of the the actual castles that you see, the earliest ones are Norman, and the most recent ones are obviously, they've been built, you know, by Victorians only 150 years ago. They're modeled after older styles of architecture, but for example, that many of the more lavish palaces, they've been restored from the early modern period, 16th century, 17th century. They were built by King James. The Tower of London was built by William the Conqueror in 1066. If you go to see the Tower of London in London, England, that's what you go to see. I don't want to make this section too long, but we do have to talk about Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket, we'll have to rewind for a second. Thomas Becket was a contemporary of Henry. In fact, he was a friend of Henry II, which is Richard's father and John's father. Henry II, he had a temper problem, as I said. He married a woman who was had a very strong will, and he had a strong will too, so they were constantly at, struggling with each other, who is the dominant partner. I don't think you can say who won, really, although after she betrays him and he defeats his sons in battle, he ends up putting her, you know, in prison for about 15 years, the end of her life. So in that sense, he is physically able to restrain her, but she still continues to undermine his authority. Another person he ends up having problems with is this Thomas of Becket person. He's not from a wealthy, famous family. He kind of works his way up through the government system, doing work for the royal government, and he becomes a companion of Henry, and they go hunting and drinking and hanging out with, you know, partying and stuff together, and Henry II trusts him. And so when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, which is the highest ranking church official in England, Henry has had problems with the church, you know, who, again, just like his wife, who has, you know, power over what, in the legal sense or in the political sense, who has more authority, the church or the royal family, the king. And he insists that the king does, and he figures once this archbishop, you know, dies, he appoints Thomas Becket to the position, thinking that he will do what he says and follow his orders. But Thomas, coming from, I guess, a lower status background, figures that now finally he doesn't have to listen to the king anymore, because now he's the Archbishop of Canterbury and he's the second most powerful person in the kingdom. And so he takes his job seriously, and he's even worse than the previous archbishop. And he drives Henry crazy because he was planning on having his man, you know, sort of do what he said in that position. And then he ends up being more difficult than the previous, you know, stubborn archbishop. So he ends up having major confrontations with him, and basically Thomas Becket has to run away to France because he's worried that he's going to get killed or thrown in jail by the king. And he's in exile for 4 or 5 years. But then there's some disagreement about Henry basically pre-ordaining his first son, Henry the young king, preparing him for being king. He has him sort of does a ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury is not there, can't do it because Thomas is in France, in Normandy, but in France anyway. He's abroad, so he has another bishop do it. And Thomas thinks that it doesn't count because it has to be done by the Archbishop of Canterbury. But Henry thinks it does, and they talk about it, and for some reason they think, Thomas thinks that Henry has agreed that he was wrong, and Henry thinks that Thomas has agreed that he was wrong. So he comes back, and then he starts punishing the bishops that helped him do the ceremony for his son. See how complicated this is? Henry is at the end of his patience. So he supposedly says, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Okay, this is important because supposedly he just says it out loud in one of his temper tantrums. He just yells at, into the air. But 4 of his men hear him say it, and they think, well, this is what the king wants. He wants somebody to take care of this archbishop for him. So they go over to Canterbury with the intention of capturing Thomas Becket and forcing him to let these other church officials go unpunished. He's praying in the cathedral in the center of the most holy place in England, and they try to get him to come with them, but he refuses. And when he refuses, he turns and he starts to pray at the altar in the Canterbury Cathedral. And, there's other guards and priests coming, so the king's men-at-arms, I guess they panic. I don't know exactly how this goes down, but they decide it's better to kill this guy than to leave him at large, to leave him where he is. So one of them takes their sword and splits his head from behind while he's praying at the altar, and then runs away. So the Archbishop of Canterbury falls down, dead, bleeding to death, with this gigantic, wound in his head. And this is the worst crime you can possibly do. So Thomas Becket, he becomes a saint. He becomes the Canterbury, he becomes a saint. His bones get buried, and there's a monument there. And people come from all over England to pray to the shrine of Thomas Becket. It becomes the most famous holy site in England. And Henry II gets blamed for the murder of the Archbishop in the most holy place in England. So things go pretty badly for Henry. He ends up dying fighting against his sons. His wife is imprisoned in a tower, and she won't do what he says or listen to him. He has this empire. It goes from Ireland all the way to Normandy and all the way down the coast of France, almost to Spain. But must have had the most stressful life ever, trying to keep all of this together. So you can see by the time Richard goes to the Crusades, spends all the money on that and gets captured, ransomed, and dies, then King John overtaxes the English people and loses the lands in France. All of these areas kind of fly apart. Like sometimes people call it the Angevin Empire, because Henry II has control of the British Isles and half of France, going all the way from Normandy to the north coast of Spain. But really, these territories are not an empire. They're just all following him because of his own personal status, power, reputation, and effort. So when Richard is replaced, Richard was a great military figure, was charismatic, was a good political leader, was very popular. When he's replaced by John, England sort of collapses. All of the pieces of the English Empire, if you want to call it that, separate and rebel. And by the time John dies and his son succeeds the throne, England is basically on its own again. And this is where the story starts to get interesting, because England will probably look like it's not going to be a very successful nation, state, kingdom for the next several hundred years. So there's going to be disasters. I didn't get to talk about the Edwards yet. That'll come next lecture. I'll replace this board with another one, and we'll start with Edward I next lecture. Obviously, there's going to be a few questions about what's going on here, but hopefully the stories are interesting. And the Crusades are going to, after Richard, become less and less important, especially in England. Edward I is going to go on crusade briefly, and then return and spend the rest of his life in England. And then there will never be another English king that goes on crusade after that. So we'll briefly touch on the Crusades when we talk about Edward I, but then we'll focus on France and England and how the British culture starts to emerge through England fighting with Scotland, Ireland, and France constantly. Okay, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon in the next lecture. Have a good day.